Imagine it is a Tuesday morning. Nothing special about it. You wake up, check your phone, maybe scroll through some headlines. Your mortgage payment went through last night. Your brokerage account is up 2% for the month, and you have got about $4,000 sitting in your checking account. You are the kind of person people would call financially responsible. You did everything right. You saved, you invested, you diversified. You are not rich, but you are solid. And that feeling of being solid, that quiet confidence that the system works because it has always worked for you, that is exactly what is about to be tested. By Wednesday evening, the first cracks appear. A regional bank in the Midwest announces a temporary pause on wire transfers. The headline gets buried under celebrity gossip and a sports trade rumor. Nobody panics. These things happen. By Thursday morning, two more banks in different states issue nearly identical statements. Operational disruptions. System maintenance. We apologize for the inconvenience. Your card still works at the grocery store, so you do not think twice. But somewhere in the back of your mind, something shifts. A small, quiet alarm that you are not ready to listen to yet. By Thursday night, the ATMs downtown are running dry. Not broken, dry. People started pulling cash at midnight, the kind of quiet, panicked cash run that does not make the 6 o'clock news but spreads through group chats and neighborhood apps like a brush fire. By Friday morning, there are lines. Real lines. 40, 50 people deep outside branches that are not even open yet. The television anchors are using calm voices and saying words like isolated and precautionary and no reason for alarm. But the lines keep growing. Now here is where it gets interesting. Here is where the story stops being about banks and starts being about you. You drive to your nearest supermarket because your wife mentioned you were low on rice and canned goods. You have got your debit card, your credit card, and about $60 in cash stuffed in your wallet from last week. You walk in, and the shelves in the dry goods aisle look like the day after a hurricane warning. Not completely empty, but stripped in that specific, unsettling way that tells you other people got here first. You grab what you can. You head to the register. The cashier looks exhausted, like she has been repeating the same sentence for 3 hours straight. Our card system is down. Cash only. You have got $60. The cart in front of you has $200 worth of groceries in it. The woman behind you has a gold coin, an actual 1-ounce American Eagle gold coin, worth over $2,000 at that morning's spot price. She holds it out to the cashier. The cashier looks at it like it is a museum artifact. She shakes her head. She cannot make change for that. She does not have a scale to verify it. She does not know what it is worth or how to process it. The woman with the gold coin walks out of the store with nothing. The man in front of you in line does not have cash or gold. He has got a 6-pack of beer, a carton of cigarettes, and 2 liters of motor oil he pulled off the shelf. He leans over and quietly offers the cashier 2 packs of cigarettes and a handshake deal for the rest of the groceries. She pauses. She looks around. She nods. He walks out with a full cart. And then, this is the part that will stay with you. You see your neighbor, the one you have been low-key dismissive of for years, the guy with the beat-up truck who grows tomatoes in his backyard and keeps chickens and always seems to be doing something practical and slightly old-fashioned. He is not in line. He is in the parking lot, and he is not stressed at all. He has got the back of his truck loaded with produce from his garden, and 3 different families are negotiating with him. Not for cash, for things. A woman is giving him a box of medication. A teenager is handing over a nearly new pair of boots. Another man is offering 2 gallons of gasoline from a red container in his trunk. Your neighbor looks at each offer carefully, nods, loads up a few items into his own bag, and hands over bags of vegetables and a dozen eggs in return. He is running a market, in a parking lot, on a Friday morning, and he has everything he needs. You stand there with your $60 and your 2 dead credit cards and the quiet, suffocating realization that the thing you spent 15 years building, the digital, intangible, system-dependent version of financial security, just became invisible. Not destroyed, not stolen, just invisible. Locked behind interfaces that are not responding and institutions that are working on it. And the man with the tomatoes is doing fine. That scene did not come from a novel. Versions of it have happened in real places, to real people, within the last 2 decades. And if you think it cannot happen where you live, you are not paying attention to the pattern. Because here is what nobody tells you in the financial literacy courses, in the investment podcasts, in the glossy personal finance magazines sitting in your dentist's waiting room. The collapse does not announce itself. It does not send you a calendar invite. It does not give you a 2-week notice so you can rebalance your portfolio and stock up on canned beans. It arrives on a Tuesday or a Thursday, and by the time the mainstream news admits what is happening, the people who were ready stopped watching the news 3 days ago because they no longer needed it. This is not speculation. This is a pattern, and the 21st century has already shown it to us repeatedly, clearly, in high definition. And most people still looked away. Let us talk about Lebanon. Not ancient history, not some distant economic textbook case. Lebanon 2019-2020, a country with a functioning banking system, a capital city known as the Paris of the Middle East, a population with college degrees and smartphones and Instagram accounts. Ordinary people had savings accounts. They had deposits. Some had been saving for decades, for retirement, for their children's education, for a down payment on a second property. And then, in the span of a few months, the banks simply stopped letting people access their own money. Withdrawal limits dropped to $200 a week, then $100, then $50. People who had $100,000 in an account could not take out enough cash to buy groceries for a family of 4 for a single week. The money was there, on paper, on a screen, in a number on a statement. But it was functionally gone, locked, frozen, and the Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value while those accounts sat untouched behind closed windows and locked doors. By 2021, more than 80% of the Lebanese population had fallen below the poverty line, not because they were irresponsible, because they trusted the system. Now go to Venezuela, not the Venezuela of 50 years ago, the Venezuela of 2016, 2017, 2018, a country sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, enormous natural wealth, and yet the bolivar, the national currency, became so worthless that people were weighing it instead of counting it because it was faster. Inflation hit 1 million%. 1 million. That is not a typo. A cup of coffee that cost 1 bolivar in the morning cost 3 bolivars by the afternoon of the same day. Workers were being paid in stacks of cash so large they could not fit in a backpack, and by the time they walked to the market, the stack had already lost a third of its purchasing power. People stopped using money entirely in large parts of the country. They traded fish for rice. They traded rice for medicine. They traded medicine for fuel. A functioning barter economy emerged inside a country that still had a central bank, a stock market, and an official currency. The currency just meant nothing anymore. And before you tell yourself that Venezuela is a special case, a political anomaly, something that could not happen in a developed economy, look at Argentina. Not a failed state, not a war zone, a country with a sophisticated urban population, a history of international trade, and a middle class that reads economic news. Argentina has experienced currency crises in 2001, 2018, 2023, and the echoes keep coming. Each time, the same sequence. The peso loses value. People race to convert savings into dollars. The government limits dollar purchases. People turn to informal markets. The official rate and the real rate diverge by 50, 80, 100%. Argentinians have become among the most financially creative people on earth, not because they wanted to, but because the system forced them to adapt or lose everything. Millions lost everything anyway. And then there is 2020. You lived through it. You remember the specific, surreal panic of walking into a pharmacy and finding the hand sanitizer shelf completely empty. You remember the photos of bare supermarket aisles, not in Caracas, not in Beirut, in Chicago, in London, in Sydney. Global supply chains, the invisible infrastructure that moves products from factories in one country to store shelves in another, seized up in a matter of weeks. Factories shut down, ships sat idle, truckers could not cross borders. And suddenly, the most powerful economies in the world had shortages of surgical masks, of basic medications, of toilet paper, of flour. The system that was supposed to be redundant, resilient, and self-correcting revealed itself to be a single, fragile thread, stretched thin across a very complicated world. The common thread running through Beirut, Caracas, Buenos Aires, and the empty shelves of 2020 is not political ideology. It is not geography. It is not the specific decisions of specific governments. The common thread is this: when systems fail, the people who depended entirely on those systems had nothing to fall back on. And the people who had something outside the system, something physical, something practical, something that did not require a password or a network connection or a functioning institution, those people ate. Those people kept their families safe. Those people had options. So ask yourself an honest question right now. If your bank froze your account tomorrow morning, not stole it, not closed it, just froze it for 72 hours, which is exactly what happened to millions of real people in the examples I just gave you, what would you do? What do you actually have, physically, in your home or on your property, that has value independent of any system? How many days could you live on what you have right now, today, without swiping a card or making a transfer or placing an order online? If that question makes you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the beginning of preparation. And what preparation actually looks like, not the fantasy version, not the bunker and ammunition version, but the historically proven, documented, real version, that is exactly what comes next. Let me tell you about a man named Selko. He is a real person, a survival instructor and writer who lived through the Bosnian War in the 1990s, trapped inside a city under siege for a full year. No electricity, no running water, no functioning government, no stores, no banks, no deliveries, just a city of ordinary people, doctors, teachers, engineers, accountants, suddenly cut off from every system they had ever relied on. And what Selko describes from that year is not what Hollywood tells you a collapse looks like. It is not dramatic explosions and heroic last stands. It is quiet, grinding, desperate negotiation. Every single day, for 365 days, negotiation for food, for water, for medicine, for warmth, and in that negotiation, certain things became the most powerful currency on earth. Not gold, not cash, not the deed to your property, the things people traded for, fought for, walked miles through dangerous streets to acquire, were things you can buy right now at your local grocery store for less than $50 total. Cigarettes. Not because everyone smoked, but because cigarettes were compact, universally recognized, emotionally valuable to people under extreme stress, and did not expire quickly. A single carton of cigarettes could be traded for enough food to feed a family for several days. A man who did not smoke could still carry cigarettes as currency and trade them for whatever he needed. Selko specifically describes watching non-smokers become some of the most effective traders in his neighborhood because they understood the cigarette not as a habit, but as a tool. Lighters and matches. This sounds absurd until you think about it for 30 seconds. Fire means warmth. Fire means cooked food, which means safe food. Fire means light in a city with no electricity. A simple, disposable lighter, the kind you see in a jar next to the register at a gas station for $1.50, became a serious trade item. 1,000 of those lighters, bought in bulk for maybe $300 total, represented more practical trading power in that environment than a gold coin worth $2,000 that nobody had a scale to verify or change to make. Antibiotics. This one is sobering. In a functioning society, you get an infection, you go to a doctor, you get a prescription, you pick it up at a pharmacy. In a collapsed system, a basic bacterial infection, the kind that would be cleared up with a 10-day course of amoxicillin, can kill you. People in Sarajevo during the siege were trading extraordinary things for basic antibiotics. A month's supply of a common antibiotic became worth more than most electronics. People who had the foresight to stockpile basic medications before the collapse were not just surviving. They were thriving by the grim standards of that reality. Soap, bleach, and basic sanitation supplies. When the water system stops working and people are collecting rainwater and melting snow, waterborne illness becomes one of the primary killers. A single bottle of unscented household bleach, the kind that costs $2 at any hardware store, can purify hundreds of gallons of water. Soap became a genuine luxury item. Hand sanitizer, feminine hygiene products, basic first aid supplies. These were the things people desperately needed and could not get, and the people who had them could trade for almost anything else. Now move forward from Bosnia to Venezuela in 2016. The context is different. No active war, no siege, but the economic collapse produced its own version of the same lesson. The bolivar was worthless. The stores were empty or unaffordable. And what filled the gap was food production. People in Caracas, a major modern city, a metropolis, started converting every available surface into growing space. Balconies became vegetable gardens. Rooftops became chicken coops. The backyard, if you were lucky enough to have one, became a production facility. A man growing sweet potatoes and raising a few chickens was not a hobbyist. He was wealthy. His harvest was his bank account, and it was one that no government decree could freeze and no inflation could devalue overnight. The Venezuelan experience also validated something that sounds almost too simple to take seriously: coffee. In a country where coffee is culturally central, a person with a supply of coffee could trade it for almost anything. Not because coffee is nutritionally essential, but because it provided comfort, ritual, and normalcy in a situation where all three had been stripped away. People will trade significant resources for the thing that makes them feel, even briefly, like life is normal. tobacco, coffee, alcohol in small quantities, chocolate. These comfort items consistently appear in the historical record of economic collapses as high-value trade goods, precisely because they address psychological need rather than just physical survival. And then the pandemic gave the developed world its own version of this lesson. Gentler, shorter, less lethal than Bosnia or Venezuela, but structurally identical. Remember the specific items that disappeared from shelves in March of 2020. Masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, obvious, but also yeast, flour, canning lids, seeds for home gardens, chest freezers, pulse oximeters, thermometers, basic over-the-counter medications. The people who had those things did not need to panic buy. The people who did not have them drove to 6 different stores and came home empty-handed. A woman in New Jersey sold a single packet of dried yeast for $14 on a neighborhood app. A man in Texas traded a box of N95 masks for a used generator. These are not dramatic war stories. These are things that happened in one of the wealthiest countries in human history in 2020 because a 6-week disruption to supply chains was enough to create scarcity of the most basic household items. Here is the number that should reframe how you think about preparation. The average American household has approximately 3 days of food on hand at any given time. 3 days. The entire modern food distribution system is built on just-in-time delivery, meaning grocery stores receive shipments every 48 to 72 hours and carry minimal inventory. If those shipments stop for any reason, a trucking strike, a fuel shortage, a banking system disruption that freezes payment processing, a natural disaster, a cyber attack on logistics infrastructure, the shelves are bare within 72 hours, not within weeks, within hours. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the designed operating model of the system you rely on every single day. So what does this mean practically? It means the person in your neighborhood who quietly stockpiles a rotating supply of staple foods, who keeps basic medications on hand, who has a few hundred lighters and a case of soap and a supply of coffee and candles and matches. That person is not a paranoid eccentric. That person is the one who will be trading from a position of strength when everyone else is standing in line, hoping the ATM comes back online. The single most important insight from every collapse scenario in modern history is this. In the first 72 hours of a crisis, the people who are most valuable are not the ones with the most money. They are the ones with the most immediately useful physical things. And in the days and weeks that follow, the picture expands, because it turns out there is a deeper layer of value that outlasts even the best-stocked pantry. It is something that cannot be looted, cannot expire, and cannot be confiscated by a government decree at 3 in the morning. It is what you know how to do, and who you know how to do it with. Think about the Great Depression for a moment. Not the statistics, not the stock market charts, not the political arguments about what caused it or ended it. Think about the actual human experience of it. 1929, 1930, 1931, banks closing, factories shutting down, unemployment hitting 25%, meaning 1 in 4 working adults had no income whatsoever. Families in cities who had been solidly middle class 2 years earlier were standing in breadlines. Men who had worn suits to work every day were selling apples on street corners for a nickel each. And then look at what happened outside the cities, on the farms, in the rural communities, among the families who had land and knew how to use it. The Depression was devastating, yes, but it was survivable in a completely different way. A family with a quarter-acre garden, a few chickens, a pig, and a root cellar full of preserved food did not go hungry. They did not eat well. They did not have luxuries, but they ate. And in the brutal arithmetic of a systemic collapse, eating is everything. Women in farming communities during the Depression sewed clothing from cotton flour sacks. The bags that held 50 pounds of flour had patterns printed on them, specifically because manufacturers knew families would reuse the fabric. Children wore dresses and shirts made from flour sack material. Shoes were resoled and resoled again until there was nothing left to resole. Soap was made at home from rendered fat and lye. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be replaced easily. And the families who had the skills to do these things, to grow, to preserve, to repair, to make, had something that money could not buy in that moment, because money had largely stopped working. Now here is a number that most people have never heard, and it should stop you cold. During World War II, the United States government launched what became known as the Victory Garden Program. Ordinary Americans, in cities, in suburbs, on rooftops, in vacant lots, in backyard plots, were encouraged to grow their own food to support the war effort. At the peak of the program, there were approximately 20 million victory gardens across the country. 20 million. And those gardens produced an estimated 9 billion pounds of food per year, which represented roughly 40% of all vegetables consumed in the United States during that period. 40% of the national vegetable supply came from ordinary people growing food in ordinary spaces, many of them with no prior farming experience, because the situation made it necessary and the community made it normal. That is not ancient history. That is living memory. And it is proof, documented, quantified, undeniable proof, that the capacity to feed yourself and your community does not require industrial infrastructure. It requires land, knowledge, and the decision to use them. Fast forward to Venezuela in 2017. The urban gardens that emerged out of necessity in Caracas and other cities were not organized by the government. They were not part of any official program. They were spontaneous, community-driven, survival-motivated responses to a system that had stopped delivering. People converted parking spaces into raised beds. They grew cassava and sweet potatoes in 50-gallon drums on apartment balconies. Community plots appeared in parks and along roadsides. The harvest from these spaces was not just food, it was independence. A family growing even a portion of their own calories had leverage that a family entirely dependent on store shelves did not have. They had something to trade. They had something to offer. They were participants in the local economy rather than victims of it. But land alone is not enough. Land without knowledge is just dirt. And this brings us to the second layer of real capital: skill. Look at the historical record of every major economic collapse, and you will find the same categories of people doing relatively well while others struggle. Mechanics and engineers who could repair things that could no longer be replaced. Doctors and nurses and anyone with medical knowledge, because health emergencies do not pause for economic crises. Carpenters and builders who could fix structures, create shelter modifications, build storage. Farmers and anyone who understood soil, seeds, growing seasons, and food preservation. Seamstresses and tailors. Electricians who could work with alternative power systems. Herbalists and anyone with practical knowledge of medicinal plants. Bakers and food processors who could convert raw ingredients into something edible and tradable. These are not romantic back-to-the-land fantasies. These are the specific skills that show up again and again in survivor accounts from the Bosnian War, from the Argentine crisis of 2001, from the Venezuelan collapse, from the Great Depression. The person who could fix a generator was more valuable than the person who owned one but could not repair it. The person who could set a broken bone or identify an infected wound and treat it appropriately had an asset that no amount of cash could replicate in a system where hospitals were overwhelmed or inaccessible. And here is the crucial thing about skill as capital. It cannot be confiscated. A government can freeze your bank account overnight. A hyperinflationary spiral can reduce your savings to worthless paper in a matter of months. A thief can take your gold or your stockpile, but nobody can reach into your mind and remove what you know how to do. Your knowledge travels with you. It works in any location. It functions in any economic environment. And unlike physical goods, it does not get used up when you use it. In fact, it compounds. Every time you practice a skill, it becomes more refined, more versatile, more valuable. Now the third layer, and this is the one that most people in the prepper and financial independence communities consistently underestimate because it is the hardest to quantify and the easiest to dismiss as soft or sentimental. It is people, community, social capital, the network of real human relationships built on trust and mutual obligation. Research on disaster survival, not theory, but actual studies of real communities that went through real catastrophic events, consistently shows the same result. Social connectedness is one of the strongest predictors of survival and recovery outcomes. A landmark study analyzing communities that survived the 1995 Chicago heat wave found that neighborhood social cohesion, whether people knew their neighbors, whether they checked on each other, whether there were functioning community organizations, was a stronger predictor of survival than income, age, or physical health. People with strong social networks were more likely to receive help, more likely to give and receive accurate information, more likely to pool resources effectively, and more likely to maintain the psychological resilience needed to make good decisions under extreme stress. This pattern repeats across contexts. Communities in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, neighborhoods in Japan after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, informal mutual aid networks that emerged in cities during the pandemic lockdowns of 2020. In each case, the communities that recovered fastest and suffered the least were not necessarily the wealthiest. They were the most connected. They had relationships of trust and reciprocity that could be activated immediately when the crisis hit, without negotiation, without contracts, without the mediation of any institution. Think about what that means in practical terms. The neighbor you help with their groceries today is the neighbor who tells you tomorrow that the bank down the street just ran out of cash. The community garden you participate in this summer is the network that shares seeds and knowledge and surplus harvest when prices spike next winter. The local skill-sharing group you join, the one that teaches canning or basic medical care or carpentry, is the community that knows who has what and who needs what when the normal distribution systems stop working. Your network is your infrastructure, and unlike financial infrastructure, it does not go down when the servers do. So you now have the full picture of what real capital looks like. It is the land or growing space that produces food independent of supply chains. It is the skills that allow you to create value in any economic environment. And it is the community of people around you who extend your capacity far beyond what any individual could manage alone. These three things, land, skill, people, are the assets that have carried human communities through every collapse in recorded history. They are not new ideas, they are ancient ones, and they are more relevant right now, today, in your specific situation, than almost anything else you will hear on a financial podcast this week. Because knowing all of this, The pattern, the history, the mechanics of what actually works means nothing if you do not act on it. And acting on it is exactly what we are going to talk about next. Here is the verdict. And I am not going to soften it for you, because you have come too far in this story to deserve anything less than the full truth. The financial system you were taught to trust, the banks, the brokerage accounts, the retirement funds, the carefully diversified portfolio your advisor put together over 3 afternoon meetings, all of it is real. All of it has value. In normal times, in stable times, in the 70, 80, 90% of your life, when the system hums along and the ATMs are full and the supply chains deliver and the institutions hold. In those times, financial assets are genuinely useful tools. I am not telling you to burn your savings account or throw your investment portfolio out the window. That would be as foolish as what you are doing right now, which is treating financial assets as your only layer of protection. Because here is what the history shows, without exception, in every single collapse scenario we have examined. Gold does not feed you on day 3. A brokerage account does not keep your child's fever down at night. A diversified portfolio does not keep you warm when the heating system fails and the stores are closed and the delivery apps are showing no drivers available in your area. These assets have enormous value on the other side of a crisis, when stability returns, when institutions rebuild, when the system reboots. But in the acute phase, in the 72 hours to 30 days when everything is actually breaking, they are nearly useless, and the people who had only those assets and nothing else are the ones you read about in the history books as casualties. The people who made it through were the ones who had built something the system could not touch. So let me give you the actual roadmap. Not theory, not philosophy. The specific, historically validated, practically actionable steps that the evidence supports. Start with food, not a bunker, not a warehouse, just depth. The average family needs roughly 2,000 calories per person per day to function. A 90-day supply of staple foods for a family of 4: rice, beans, oats, canned proteins, cooking oil, salt, sugar, honey, costs somewhere between $300 and $600 if you build it gradually, buying a little extra each week. It takes up roughly the space of a standard closet. It requires no special equipment and no special knowledge to maintain. And it means that if the supply chain seizes up for any reason, a banking disruption, a natural disaster, a trucking strike, a cyber attack on payment infrastructure, you are not one of the 40 million Americans standing in a panicked line at a grocery store that runs out of inventory within 72 hours. You are at home, calm, with options. Then go deeper on the consumable trade goods. Think about what the Bosnian War taught us. Think about what Venezuela showed us. Build a small, rotating stockpile of the things that become currency in disrupted environments. A few hundred disposable lighters, available in bulk online for roughly $30 per 100. Several dozen bars of basic soap. A supply of over-the-counter medications, pain relievers, antihistamines, anti-diarrheal medications, basic wound care supplies, coffee if you do not drink it yourself, because other people do and they will trade for it. Candles, batteries in common sizes. These items cost almost nothing in normal times and become extraordinarily valuable in abnormal ones. You are not hoarding. You are positioning. There is a difference, and the difference is the intention behind it. Now address the skill gap. Be honest with yourself about what you actually know how to do if the systems stopped supporting you. Can you grow food? If the answer is no, start this weekend. Container gardening requires no land, minimal investment, and a single season of practice will teach you more than any book. A 5-gallon bucket, a bag of potting soil, and a packet of seeds is a $10 investment in a skill that has fed human beings through every crisis in recorded history. Can you perform basic medical care? A wilderness first aid course, typically available for around $80 for a weekend, will teach you wound care, infection management, fever treatment, fracture stabilization, skills that, in a functioning system, you will hopefully never need, and in a broken system will make you one of the most valuable people in any room. Can you repair things? A basic understanding of plumbing, electrical systems, and carpentry does not require a trade certification. It requires a library card, a YouTube channel, and the willingness to practice on something that does not matter before you need to apply it to something that does. Then build the network. This is the step that feels the least urgent and is actually the most important. Start with your immediate neighbors, not a prepper group, not an online community, not a forum. Your actual physical neighbors, the ones who live within walking distance of your front door. Introduce yourself if you have not. Find out what they do, what they know, what they need. Organize a neighborhood skill share, a community garden plot, a simple mutual aid arrangement. These relationships do not need to be built around crisis scenarios. They can be built around ordinary community, a block party, a shared garden, a tool library where neighbors lend each other equipment instead of everyone buying their own. The relationship is what matters. The specific format is irrelevant. Research on social resilience is unambiguous on this point. A study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that communities with high levels of social cohesion recover from disasters at a rate measurably and significantly faster than isolated communities with similar or greater financial resources. The number they found was striking. Strong social networks increased individual survival probability in crisis scenarios by as much as 30% compared to socially isolated individuals with equivalent material resources. 30%. That is not a marginal benefit. That is the difference between making it and not making it. And then, only then, after the food depth, after the trade goods, after the skill development, after the community building, consider a modest allocation to precious metals, not as your primary crisis hedge, as a bet on the recovery. Gold and silver are not useful in the acute phase of a collapse, as we have thoroughly established, but they are extraordinarily useful in the reconstruction phase, when institutions are rebuilding, when currencies are being re-established, when people who held real value through the storm are positioned to acquire assets from people who did not. 5 to 10% of your investable assets in physical precious metals, not paper gold, not ETFs, actual coins or bars you can hold in your hand, is a reasonable allocation. Not a survival strategy, a recovery strategy. There is a crucial difference, and understanding it may be the most important financial reframe in this entire video. So here is where we land. The system you live inside right now is not permanent. It is not guaranteed. It is not invincible. It is a network of interdependent institutions and supply chains and digital infrastructure that is more fragile than it looks from the inside. And that has already failed. Completely, suddenly, catastrophically, in dozens of real places, to real people, within your lifetime. The pattern is not hidden. It is not classified. It is sitting in the public record, in survivor accounts, in economic histories, in the living memories of people who watch their savings become worthless and their systems go dark. And the difference between the people who made it through those moments and the people who did not was not intelligence. It was not income. It was not political connections, or insider knowledge, or the right investments. It was preparation. Quiet, practical, unglamorous, historically validated preparation. Food in the closet. Skills in the hands. Neighbors at the door. So I want to leave you with one image. Not a statistic. Not a policy argument. An image. It is 72 hours into the disruption. The ATMs are offline. The card readers are down. The store shelves are stripped. And somewhere in your city, there are two people standing on the same street corner. One of them has a gold coin in their pocket and a phone that cannot connect to anything. The other one has a bag of coffee, a box of antibiotics, a lighter, and 3 neighbors who are already waiting for them at home with things to trade and hands to help. Which one of those people are you right now? And more importantly, which one of those people are you going to be by this time next month? Because the window does not stay open forever. It never does.